If you find yourself absolutely flummoxed by the topic of certificates and managing certificates, don't sweat it because there's a lot of people that really just cannot seem to get the concept of certificates wrapped around in their head correctly. I found that one of the reasons why, at least in traveling around and talking to people, is I believe that a lot of people kind of look at certificates and see more there than what is really there, or they kind of overthink the issue of certificates. Now, that's easy to do because when you start digging around in certificate services, there are a whole bunch of checkboxes and options and selections that you can choose that are completely meaningless outside of ADCS. They're not really, they're topics that are not shared with really any other technologies that are out there. But the thing that you should recognize is that in most situations, when you are going about creating certificates in Active Directory using ADCS, more often than not, you're going to be following some sort of recipe from a vendor, some sort of recipe from a developer. That the people that are creating the software that you have to lay into place are probably going to tell you the specific things that you have to have in place for that certificate to work. Now, one of the things that is also sort of confusing about how certificates works has to do with the notion of certificate templates. I like to think of these templates as kind of dividing the world into the person who authors the form and the person who fills out the form. Right, so let's say you're filling out some form. Maybe it's they're asking for your name and address. Well, there's some person out here who actually has to go and write this form. So he's the person that says, okay, name, and then there's a blank, and then your address, and then there's another blank, and then there's your phone number, and then there's another blank. The form author is doing this because he's interested in the information that you as the form filler outer person are going to later end up using when they fill out the form. You can take this analogy and work it directly in with the concept of certificate templates. Now, when you're managing your certificate templates, you are actually going about creating the form. You're not really filling it out. It's when you go and enroll for certificates, it's when you go for dealing with auto enrollment of certificates. That is the equivalent of when you're actually filling out the information in the form. So if you keep that kind of straight in your head, I think these templates will make a lot more sense for you. The other part about the certificates and templates that can get confusing is the fact that not all the templates are available directly out of the box. They're there, they're just not issued for use. And the way in which you go about issuing them for use involves duplicating an existing template and then making adjustments. Now, as you dig deeper into certificates, the reason why these are duplicated to begin actually makes a lot of sense because there are some specific checkboxes that have to be in place for them to work. But the first time or two that you do it, it just feels a little weird, the fact that you're creating copies of certificate templates and then modifying those copies. Here in this nugget, I'm going to kind of order this nugget a little bit differently than some of the other ones in that I want to start the process, not necessarily from, dealing with deployment and renewal and auto enrollment and key recovery and archival. I want to start instead from the end user of these certificates, which for you is probably the position that you've been in for a very long period of time. You are the end user because you are this person over here that is filling out the form to request certificates. You can do that in IIS. You can do that from the certificates website. You can do that directly from the certificates console. There are a lot of places where that can be really automated. And so you have actually been kind of an end user of certificates for a reasonable period of time. And now with this nugget and with your new ADCS build, it's an opportunity for you to actually be the form creator as opposed to the form filler outer. Let's start by taking a look at a couple of the locations where the generation of certificates, the request and issuance process can be automated. You're probably most familiar with the website. There's this website you can go to, Internet Explorer, to actually request certificates. But I'm not going to show you that website just for now because I want to show you a couple of the alternate locations that you may not have actually seen before. One place is here in IIS. I've actually created a website here called, I think I called it Test My Site, or Test My Web. And this website is here. It's just another website. And I think if I go to test my web, let's see here. If I go to https testmyweb.company.pri, I'll see hello world. And I've done that just to show you that I can, if I have the right certificates in place, have an HTTPS connection. And I'm not going to go into the binding and all that. Jason Helmick has a beautiful IIS 8.5 series if you want to go into how IIS works and all the bindings and things. But the one thing I do want to show you here in IIS is that when it comes time to actually create new certificates, to create the requests and then deliver those requests, you can actually accomplish that here under the server and server certificates. This gets forgotten by a lot of people when they get so used to going to the Cert Services website that we forget about some of these really cool automations that exist. You can, now that we've got our ADCS server up and operational, actually really greatly accelerate the generation of certificates right here by clicking to create a domain certificate. If in this case, I generally put in the name of the website that I'm interested in using, so it'll be, checkmystuff.company.pri, because the common name in web server certificates most often corresponds to the HTTPS address that we need to go to. The rest of the information here is unnecessary. It's required in order to actually get to the next step, but it doesn't really do much in terms of encoding this directly into the certificate. So I can put in CBT, Nuggets, and then OU, and then Denver, and then CO, and then US, and click Next. And it's here where I can just connect it directly to my company CA, right there, and then give it a friendly name. Check my stuff. When I hit Finish, you'll notice something interesting that, bam, this process goes directly out to the CA. It issues a request. The CA, just right out of the box, is automatically configured to fulfill that request. And when it fulfills the request, it delivers the certificate back to this web server, and the web server puts it in the correct location so that it can be later used and rebound to a website. I love this little example here because unlike the multi-step process that it requires to use the CertServe website, this is very, very simple. It's very easy to do. There's another location actually where you can kind of work with these as well. And if I open up an MMC console and I open up the certificates console here, I can show you another place that a lot of people also kind of forget about. Now I'm going to associate this with my user account, but if I'm depending on the use here, I may need to associate with the computer account as opposed to my user account. When I do it to actually let's do it to my computer account instead so I can show you the certificate that's probably already in there. I'll associate it with the local computer and hit OK. And if we take a look here, I believe under personal, we should see, there it is. Yep, there is the certificate that was requested by IIS and then was issued off of our certificate services infrastructure. So we have it here. It is now a certificate that exists on the server because it is stored in the personal/certificates store under local computer. Anything that has to do with services, anything that has to do with this server fulfilling a function, you're generally going to find it in the local computer store here under personal and certificates. If it's a user certificate, if it's something that verifies you, if it authenticates you as a human being, well, then you'll probably find it in the personal store. Although there are going to be a variety of exceptions to this rule. Again, follow the recipe of the vendor, and that will get you the certificates that you require. Now I told you that certificates, in order for them to function, they have to have a fully trusted chain all the way back up to the root. And so if I take a look at this certificate, I can see that, okay, I have my certificate. It was issued by company CA. And if I take a look at the certification path, I have the certificate and then the certificate chain right here. This is the certificate, and then this is the chain up to the company root certificate. You already know this. You've dealt with certificates before, so you're familiar at least with the notion of what root certificates are. However, when you've been doing this in the past, it's probably likely that the root certificate, if you bought this from a GoDaddy or if you bought it from a VeriSign, the root certificate is GoDaddy or it's a VeriSign certificate. Now, when you are actually requesting and purchasing those certificates, the reason why they're automatically trusted by Windows is not because Windows is some sort of special entity. No, the reason why it's automatically trusted is because Microsoft has included a variety of root certificates already in the Trusted Root Certification Authorities subfolder here. Windows will trust any certificate that comes from a root server that exists in this location. So if I go to, I don't know, if I go to Thought, bam, I'm going to have it. I go to VeriSign, bam, it's going to exist there because they already exist here. Now, one of the things you should be aware of when you create an enterprise root CA, One of the nifty parts about creating an enterprise root CA is that enterprise root CA can integrate with your Active Directory and deliver its root certificates automatically here to all the machines in your environment. This happens automatically. As soon as you end up installing ADCS and turning on the root server, it will interface with group policy to deliver the certificate, the root cert, and locate it in this location here. So because we've done that, that little piece of automation is already done for us. If you are doing a multiple tier, so you have a root cert and a policy cert and an issuing cert, you'll probably find the root cert here and then also an issuing certificate here as well. In fact, there's my issuing certificate for company CA. So again, I told you that certs really seem kind of complicated, but the reality is that you can really overthink them. And if you just think about the cert being in the proper location, and that it having the proper root cert and probably also the proper intermediate cert, well, as long as all those things exist in the correct location here in certificates, well, you're going to end up having that trusted chain. Now, what a lot of people don't recognize, however, is it is possible for you to actually request certificates from this location. In fact, if I right-click here on certificates, I can choose all tasks and choose to request a new certificate. We'll talk in a minute about how we go about defining the certificates that we could request. But this is a really nifty way on a Windows machine for you to request a new certificate based off of a template that you have issued. We'll get there as well. So let's say here under Next, I want to, using my Active Directory enrollment policy, which is the policy that's available, again, right out of the box, nothing changed from that last nugget. From here, I can request one of the available certificates that exists, a computer certificate. So that's one of the default ones. Also, that response signing certificate template that we created back on that last nugget. That's also available because I've issued the certificate template. In both of these cases, if I want to see more details about these certs, well, I can just see, well, what uses can that certificate be used for? Now you'll see here that this cert can be used for digital signatures. This cert can be used for key encipherment, for also client and server authentication, and it has a validity period of 365 days. If I look at the properties here, I can also potentially go through and add some additional stuff directly into that certificate request if the request has made it available. It has enabled these custom bits to be done as you request the certificate. So I can change here, for example, so that this certificate uses a subject alternative name, a DNS name, or a subject name here of something that is perhaps different than the actual server name that's on this machine. I can adjust extensions here. I can adjust the private key information and in the CA itself. These exist here again because we have templates, and the templates contain the information that define what that certificate should do. Now with that, all right, so that's the user side. Again, that's the person who is filling out the form. Let's take a minute now and talk about the person who actually creates the form and the job that they have to go through. So let me close this down. We're not going to come back to this. And I want to go to the Certification Authority site here. And I want to show you that here under my CA, well, first I'll show you this issued cert. That's the web server cert that we created right there. Let's start by talking about the templates. Okay, so the kinds of templates that we can create and how we make them available. Here under certificate templates are a variety of different certificate templates that are now currently available to be issued. Okay, right out of the box again, the only change that we customized was the one up here. We may, however, have a need because of an application or a service or some piece of hardware to create our own templates that have different rules for what the certificate is used for, different reasons for its being. So when I'm creating that form, maybe one form needs to have a phone number on it and another form needs to have an email address. One example of a certificate that you probably will want to create is a code signing certificate. If you're going to play with PowerShell at all, actually signing your PowerShell scripts is a good idea so that you can set your execution level so that it's going to verify that the script is actually signed. Otherwise, I have to set the execution level to a really loose setting that's probably not great as far as security is concerned. Now the way in which I can do that is to go here under Manage to take a look at all the templates that exist. This long list of templates are all the ones that are available here in 2012 R2. And it's here where I duplicate one of the templates in order to make changes to it. Sort of the weird part about how this works. So let's take this code signing certificate. This is one that I would use again to sign a PowerShell script. And if I right click here, I can duplicate the template. And first, let's just change this to a code signing for PowerShell. That's the name of the cert that I want. When I do that, I want to set this up as a cert that's going to have a little bit longer of a life. And so maybe I don't want the validity period to be a year. Maybe I want the validity period to be 2 years. Obviously, the validity period here needs to be less than the validity period of the CA, the root cert, so the CA itself. And then also, what is the renewal period? So at what point do I need to go back and renew this certificate? I can publish the certificate in Active Directory so that it can be made available as part of that Active Directory enrollment policy, like what we saw earlier. And then back here under compatibility is where I can adjust which of the compatibility settings I want to associate with the cert. Now, you can think of these compatibility settings as kind of similar to your Active Directory domain level and your forest level. So at later levels, there are more functionalities that are made available. Conversely, at later levels, the older versions of the operating system are not going to be able to work with those certs because they aren't aware of what those new functions are. So you have to have a balance here in terms of which functionalities do you want to add and which machines do you intend on actually using these certs and the functions that exist in the cert. So you'll see here that there are a variety of template options that are added as part of changing the compatibility settings here to the most recent version. Now each certificate, the delivery process of a certificate has a request portion and then the issuance portion. So somebody or something out there needs to request a certificate, and then somebody or something needs to approve that certificate and then issue the cert out to the machine or user. Here under the request handling tab is where I can identify some of the purposes for the certificates and then some of the characteristics that are associated with it once it gets delivered. So what do I want to do? Encryption? Do I want to sign something? This is a code signing cert, so I'm not doing encryption. I probably wouldn't set this up for encryption. So I'm going to set this for signature here. A lot of times if you're doing certs that need to be able to be moved around, so I want to take a cert on my desktop and then transfer it over to my laptop so I can continue signing my different PowerShell scripts via the same certificate. Well, in order to do that, I need to have the private key able to be exported off of that first machine. This is a little bit looser of a security basis whenever you do that, but it does allow you to take that certificate and drop it onto some other location. There are a variety of also areas in where we can select the renewal options for certificates, and when it comes time to renew that cert, do I want it to be auto-renewed? Do I want it to be auto-renewed with the same key, for example? If it's a smart card cert, do I want to use an existing key if I can't create a new key? So it's down here where I can define, well, what are my renewal options? And I'll show you a couple other renewal options here as well that you may want to turn on when it comes time to actually create these in your environment. Now, renewing with the same key obviously is, again, I'm just keeping that key lifetime around for a longer period of time. So that could be a security thing, but it just makes things easier to work with. And in the case of here with code signing certs, I'm just validating that the contents of the PowerShell script are contents of the script that I wrote because I'm signing it with my certificate. I can also down here define what I want to do when the certificate is used and I'm dealing with the private key. Do I want to prompt the user, or do I just want to enroll the subject without any prompting? I can choose which cryptographic suite that I want, and then also some other settings here about the key size and how the algorithm is used and what the provider is. There are a variety of templates I can use as well. So if I've got later templates that I want to or earlier templates that I want to supersede with newer templates, this will allow me to take any of the certs that have been created with this template and supersede those that were created by a previous template. You see this happening a lot anytime there's any kind of migration of templates from one version to another or from one server to another. I can also define what the extensions should be. Now it's here where, again, there could be a little bit of confusion, but a lot of times you're only going to be doing this because you're told to from a vendor or you're told to in some sort of instruction manual. Now when we're looking at these extensions, there are a variety of different things that we can set up. So the basic constraints, okay, how do I want to set up some of the basic constraints? Do not allow the subject to issue certificates to other CAs. Here's the certificate template information. Do I want to set up an issuance policy so that I can say, all right, well, here are the types of certificates that when I create this cert is going to follow one of these policies that exists here. This is all kind of getting a little bit out of scope for what we're trying to accomplish in this nugget, but recognize that different certificates can have different levels of trust. So a high assurance certificate, for example, is considered to be a more trusted cert than a lower assurance certificate. And other different policies here, again, define how we are creating these certificates and the rules that we're laying into place when we go about creating the certificates. So under cancel here, this is again the issuance policies for that. A big deal down here is the bottom one, which we call key usage. Now, key usage is probably best described again. I'm going to bring up my pen here. It's best described again by this little analogy that I started this nugget with. So I've got, whoops, his legs are disconnected. Here, there are your legs. So let's say I've got my little happy guy here, and he is creating a new template, and he's got name, and he's there, and he's got the address, and he's got the phone number here. When our little form creator person here is creating the form, that form is going to be used for a particular purpose, right? I wouldn't create the form unless I had a known reason for creating it. And in fact, if I had a different form up here, this form may have some similar stuff on it, right? It might have name, it might have address, it might have email address. And so although some of the information is the same, the purpose of this form, the use of this form, is going to be different than the use for this form. That's what we're talking about here when it comes time for key usage. So a certificate built into the certificate will define what the certificate can be used for. Although two certificates may have a lot of similar stuff in them, the certificate's key usage defines whether I can use this for server authentication versus client authentication, or for digital signatures versus encryption. So this is, again, it's a great metaphor here, because when you're creating a cert based off of a template, every so often you may have to come back here under key usage and define additional reasons why the certificate is being used. So digital signature, proof of origin, non-repudiation, and so on, signing, CRIL signing. That can also happen under here for application policies, for which of the possible application policies, the enhanced key usage policies, that a certificate can be used for. Now I'll tell you, it's this application policy up here that is it's horribly named, because here in this version it's called application policy. In previous versions it was called EKU for enhanced key usage. Now I told you over in key usage that there were a lot of different ways in which you can define how the cert would be used, but there are only a couple of checkboxes there. It's here where you can then further define what that cert will be used for. Only for client authentication. Only for DNSSEC, only for document signing. And a lot of times when you end up creating certificates, like the Hyper-V replica certificate we're going to create, or template we're going to create here in just a minute, I actually have to go in here and define the EKU, the enhanced key usage policy for the cert, so that it can be used appropriately by the server that plans on using it. Right? I can't create a certificate for client authentication and then use it for server authentication. That's just the whole point here. Now, I'm only interested in using this for code signing, so I don't have to touch much in this tab here. Now, let's see here. Under subject name, this is the location where I can define the contents of the cert. In other words, the stuff that gets inserted to determine what the certificate can be used to authenticate against. Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can accomplish that. One is that the template can only be created based off of information that comes in via the request. So here you can see that when I create a certificate, the subject name for this certificate is always going to be the fully qualified, the fully distinguished name of that machine. Right? The subject alternate name is always going to be the UPN, the user principal name of that machine. So anytime anybody creates a cert, the actual cert that gets issued will have this encoded within the certificate. Now the reason why you do that is, let's say I have a server here. Okay, this is my web server, and this is called w1.company.pri. Now w1.company.pri, when we went through that whole process earlier in IIS to come over here to our CA and request a cert, that process created a request over here to the CA that the CA is encoded to automatically fulfill, because it's been requested by a person that's part of the domain, a machine that's part of the domain. And then the issued cert comes back down here onto the web server. This happens because down here in the bottom, the Active Directory, or the certificate itself, is is populated with information that exists as part of Active Directory. I can, as a cert server, authenticate the fact that this is the server name of that server because it's an Active Directory machine. So I already know, because I trust Active Directory, that that is the name, and so I'm just going to give you this certificate that includes that as information. Now, alternatively, I could actually click up here, which allows me to supply information in the request. And the problem here is that, if I bring again back my little pen here, and I got my server w1.company.pri, if I allow the person to create a certificate and then supply that information in the request, this means that the person doing the requesting can use any subject name. And right now does not actually require approval to do that. So a person here could nefariously create a certificate called w2.company.pri or star.company.pri and then use that perhaps for some not so great reasons. So this just shouldn't alarm you, because there are some cases where you may want to make this possible. But be aware that if you do, that's what the error message is here for. If you do actually select to supply that information in the request, you want to lock this down so that some certificate manager somewhere has the ability to approve that request. That's what this error message is here all about. Now, because this is a code signing cert, I'm just going to build it from the Active Directory information. It makes things easier. There's a couple of server stuff in here, some issuance requirement stuff. Just like I talked about before, if we do set these up so that it needs to have approval, well, I can choose to either require approval by the CA certificate manager or a number of authorized signatures. And who those are is determined here by the policy type. This approval process happens whenever you create a request back over here in the certification authority, and that request will end up popping up here in this pending requests location, and you'll have to right-click the certificate and choose to approve it. So either you as the manager or someone you delegate will have the ability to actually accomplish that. One way in which you can accomplish that is through the use of what's called an enrollment agent, which I'll talk about here in just a second. So let me go back here, and I'm not going to set this up because I want to just automatically approve these requests. Now, even though I'm setting this up so they can be automatically approved, I have the ability to use this security tab here to define users and groups that will have the ability to, for example, read and enroll a certificate. So even if I don't have a manager that has to specifically approve the request, I can constrain things here by saying only the administrators or perhaps domain admins will have the ability to read and enroll certificates. In other words, to make a request for a certificate and then have that certificate be issued to them. You have to have read and enroll permissions for you to be able to enroll a certificate on a machine. So, very important point. Very important point also is, in some cases, the need to auto-enroll certificates. Now, the read and enroll permission gives someone the ability to use a tool like IIS or use a tool like the Certificates Manager console to enroll the certificate, to request that cert and put it in the proper location in the certificate store. But in certain circumstances, you may want to actually turn on auto-enrollment so that every person in some organizational unit or every machine in some organizational unit will automatically enroll for a specific certificate. Let's say, for example, that we want to create this certificate so that every user has their own code signing cert, and it is automatically created and automatically put in the proper location. Well, I can set this up here as an auto-enroll certificate, and a little bit later on when I configure group policy, I can turn on the auto-enrollment policy to automatically enroll any cert that has this checkbox selected for the proper user or for the proper computer. So read, enroll, auto-enroll. Really important. I can guess that these are probably test questions because it's pretty basic stuff as it relates to certificate services. So with all these things set up now, if I come back here, make sure I got that set up here, we now have a PowerShell certificate template that we can now issue for use. Let me right-click here and issue this template. Oops, not here. Actually, I need to do it back over here. Come back over here to Certificate Templates and then create a new certificate template to issue. Right now, I just have a template. It's just sitting somewhere. It's not actually able to be used just yet. In order to use it, I have to come up here and choose certificate template to issue, and then define my code signing PowerShell certificate, and bam, it is now available for use. So let's actually see the fruits of our labor. Let's see if we can actually enroll for this new code signing certificate so I can start going through and signing my PowerShell scripts. Let me see here. So I got my, let's see, I've got this up, but this is the wrong, I've pointed it to the wrong location. I need to actually repoint this to the same computer. In fact, let's just close this down and make it easy. I actually need to point this now to my user account because the code signing certificate authenticates me as the user, not the computer. I want to prove that I was the one that wrote this certificate, not the computer. So here under Yes, we'll come back here and add the snap in for certificates under my user account. And here I probably won't find any certs in my personal store because there aren't any yet. So I can come here to the, let's see here, all tasks and request a new certificate. And if I've done everything correctly under the enrollment policy, I should see, oh, there it is, my code signing certificate for PowerShell. That's pretty swell. If I had set this certificate so that the certificate would allow me to adjust the contents of the subject, then I could put in information in here if I wanted to. But the information here is going to be fulfilled because I set that lower setting. So it's going to be constructed from Active Directory attributes as opposed to being done as part of the request. If I select this and choose Enroll, I hope this works. Yay, it worked. I can click here to see that the status has succeeded, and the certificate is now available here in my personal store. So with that, I can use, for example, I can go down here under PowerShell, and I can now use the set authenticode signature commandlet as the mechanism to actually sign a .ps1 file. Pretty cool, huh? Now these certs are obviously powerful things, right? So as soon as I create them, I've got this cert over here that, as you can see, well, it allows me to do some neat stuff, and the path is good, and this cert's going to be around for a pretty long period of time. In fact, it's around till 2016. Sometimes I may, however, just not really want those certificates out for that long of a period of time. Maybe Greg Shields, the user, has been creating some really awful PowerShell scripts, and as a result, I need to shut him down. I need to disable his abilities to sign these things because he is, in fact, a very bad person. He is not. I'd like to think of myself as a good person, but I could be a very bad person, at least for the sake of argument. So back here under the issued certs, you'll see here that I have right here the template that we created for code signing. This template here has got a big old bunch of numbers that refers to the functionality that I've added in here to the certificate, but this is the code signing cert that was created by me just a second ago. When I need to revoke that cert, remember, we have all of the CRILs set up, we have our CDP set up, so that as soon as I revoke this, after some period of time, it's going to appear in that certificate revocation list that will check, that every user will then end up checking against. If I want, I can choose all tasks here and then revoke the certificate if I want. This will essentially remove the certificate and specifically state that this cert is not to be used for this function by this user. The cert is invalid. Now there are a variety of reason codes here, and in every case, this revocation is permanent, with one exception, right down here, certificate hold. If you want to not completely revoke a certificate, but allow it to be unrevoked, this is the only reason code that you can use. The other ones are permanent. But if you choose this reason code here and revoke the certificate, you can later unrevoke the certificate if you want. Okay, I would be aware of that reason code because that is the only one that exists out there. Let's go through a second example here. Now, I'm going to flip back here to my server. This was the Hyper-V Manager server that we were looking at before. And if you recall, when we did Hyper-V Server, we went here to our replication settings for Hyper-V Replica, and we wanted to use certificate-based authentication, but I didn't actually have a certificate that I could use. In order to use it, I needed to have a certificate that was in the right location, that is not expired, that has client and server authentication in the EKU, remember our enhanced key utilization, should have a private key, should have a valid root certificate, and should have a subject common name that is equal to the common name of the server. Let's go ahead and create a template that we can use now for Hyper-V Replica, and let's see if we can actually make this thing work. So I'm going to come back here to my templates, and let's find a good starting point. That's probably like a computer certificate. So let's duplicate this template here for a computer certificate and give it all the necessary bits for 2012 R2. And then we'll change this to be our Hyper-V replica template. So let's go Hyper-V replica. I'll give it another longer validity period here and publish the certificate in Active Directory. But now I need to create that certificate that follows the rules that are required for Hyper-V replica. Let's see here. So what are my rules now? For request handling, I need to make sure that the private key can be exported here. And I think the rest of these are fine. Let's see, for cryptography, we're fine with the default cryptographic provider. I'm not dealing with any superseded extension or templates, but I do need to come over here to the application policies and actually set this up so that I'm using, it already is here, client authentication and server authentication. That's good. That means that I picked a good template because it includes both of those requirements here in this request. I then need to, let's see here, for the subject name, I need to create the subject name that is equal to, let's say, the DNS name. So it has to be clust4.company.pri. I want to make sure that I do that. And I'll do the same thing here for the subject alternate name as well, so that I'm going to create that certificate appropriately. And I think that's probably good. I'm not going to worry about approvals here, so it's no need to create a bunch of extra steps, because here under security, my domain admins have the ability to read and enroll the proper certificate. So if we've got these set up correctly, gosh, I hope we're good here. Let me close this down. Let me come back over here and then create a new template to issue. And here's my Hyper-V replica. There it is. So if that's done correctly, I should be able to come back over here and open up the console, the MMC console, and MMC, and then now let's go through the process of enrolling for that certificate. I have the proper permissions to be able to do that, so this should be okay. So I'm going to add in here the snap in, but this time the certificates node I'm going to add in is the computer account, because I'm not interested in myself as a user. I got to have this thing as a computer. So let me go now to the personal location, just like before. That's where, this is really the location where pretty much all of the certificates that you're going to use for a lot of regular uses will be found. So if I right click here and choose to request a new certificate, I'm going to use the AD enrollment policy just like before, except this time I'm going to choose the Hyper-V replica certificate that's out there. There's the one. I'll enroll it, and if everything's good, then we can see that, yep, we've succeeded with the enrollment. So I've requested the certificate. The certificate is then issued to this server. And then if I go back over here to clust4 and the Hyper-V settings, let's see if I've now got all the bits in place to turn on HTTPS-based authentication. Bam, bam, and select. And what do you know? There's the certificate I can use for authentication. See, I told you, the problem with certification and certificates is not that they're hard. It's just that you can really overthink them. But if you just follow the instructions very specifically, the certificate that you need follows a very definable, very repeatable recipe that ultimately results in what you're looking for. And bam, we now have, well, I don't have a primary server, but we now have HTTPS-based authentication for that machine. A couple other interesting templates that are out here to look at. There's one called, back over here, there's one called an enrollment agent, both the agent and the computer. So this is a person, this is a computer. I told you that when we are going through the process of actually approving certificate requests, and we're not using those NTFS-like permissions, I actually want a certificate manager or a delegate to be able to approve those things. Well, one of the ways in which I can define who the delegate is by creating an enrollment agent. And without going through the whole certificate process of customizing the template again, you can make a person an enrollment agent, or you can make a computer an enrollment agent. And the way that you make them an enrollment agent is when they possess an enrollment agent certificate. So if they have that certificate and it's properly formatted and properly trusted, they have the ability to approve certificate requests. This is a common use when you want a person or a computer to, for example, enroll for smart card certificates on behalf of users. So you got a person, I don't know, they're at the help desk, and you don't want to give them full access to the certification authority so that they're actually a cert manager. Maybe you just want them to be able to create smart card requests. Well, when I duplicate this template, I can then define in the template what I want them to be able to do and who owns the certificate. So all of it's defined here when I create the form. Another important cert that you probably want to set up is what's called a key recovery agent. In fact, I believe that's actually one of our requirements here, is setting up key archival and recovery. So these key recovery agents are individuals or computers, or they're just entities that have the ability to recover keys. So I've lost it. The key for the private key for this certificate happens to be somewhere where I can recover it. Well, the person who is a key recovery agent will have the ability to then archive or to recover that key. Once I do that, I probably should make sure that any of the certificates that I create have the ability to, I should go back here to my Hyper-V replica server, to have the ability to publish that certificate in Active Directory so that I have the ability to recover it later on. Without that, if I lose the certificate, I've probably also lost the private key. So if you get asked questions about key archival and recovery, just be aware that having a backup is really nice. There's that publish cert. And then publishing it to Active Directory is another good thing. Having the key recovery agent set up so that a person can actually find the cert, recover that cert, is also really important. Now there's one last piece here that I got to talk to you about, and that is dealing with Active Directory. And I want to come back here. Oops, didn't log into this guy. I want to come back in here and show you some of the group policies that exist for dealing with your certificates. Now I told you already that by default, when you create your ADCS server, it ends up deploying out its root cert and its issuing certs, all the intermediate stuff, out to the machines in your organization. Group policy can help with this. Now, when you do that, if you come down here to GPMC, you can use group policy also to define some of the other configurations for how you want certificate services to work. That happens here under any one of the policies, under policies, Windows settings, then security settings, and then down here under public key policies. Now, when you're creating these policies allow you to define how you would deliver certificates to people that attach to Active Directory, whether they be users, whether they be computers. So for example, the certificate enrollment policy is kind of your master toggle switch for how you define how these certificates will get deployed. So here is the enrollment policy, and here is automatic enrollment, which has been enabled for this policy. We also need to come down here to our other item, down here, to turn on auto enrollment and to set that auto enrollment policy. Now it's here where people can get also confused, because all I'm doing here is setting up the structures to enable certificates to be enrolled or to be auto enrolled. In order for them to be auto enrolled, I have to do so back from the certificate template itself. So back on my, where's my code signing cert? If I were on my code signing cert to enable auto enrollment, which I can't here because I will just duplicate it and show you, to turn on auto enroll, that checkbox has to be turned on. So it's in two places. I have to turn on auto enrollment through group policy. Here's the policy here. And then I have to turn it on per certificate over here in the certificate template. Okay, a couple of different places where that has to happen. This is also the location here under group policy where I can define renewal as well. So when I set up either enrollment or auto enrollment, I can automatically set up as well whether I want a renewal to occur. That's nice because you don't want to end up with some 2, 3, 5 years down the road where the certificate expires and maybe you're not around. You don't even know that the certificate's expired. You want that certificate probably to auto renew itself so you don't end up in having services that just for some reason stop functioning. Now once you set up any of these policies here, you can then define which of the certificates you want to end up deploying out via group policy. So maybe I'm doing EFS, for example. So when I come over here to EFS, it is here where I can define a data recovery agent for EFS. It is here where I can define the certificate. Let's see, that's actually the cert that EFS uses. The data recovery agent is needed so that EFS can actually be recovered by some administrator later. And it's here where I can define what the certificate is going to be that will correspond to the recovery agent itself, so that I can just browse for it and then end up pushing it out to all the different machines that this group policy object corresponds to. So again, useful way here in group policy to help you deliver the certificates out to whomever you need to. Also helpful for setting up auto enrollment, also helpful for setting up just enrollment, but all this links again to all the stuff that we're looking at in the template and also back in the certificates console itself. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about some of the introductory bits associated with managing certificates. And there's a whole lot more here. And if you feel like there was a little bit of a glossing over of some of the topics, I mean, what are we, like almost an hour into this, and this is just the basics. So yeah, certificates can be a little bit challenging to kind of figure out, at least in the beginning. But if you go through the recipes that that your vendors or even that Microsoft are requesting out of you, as you saw with Hyper-V Replica, creating the certificate templates that fulfill the needs of those services is a relatively trivial thing to do. We also talked in this nugget about how to implement and manage the deployment, validation, and revocation of certificates, how you actually go through the console and approve certs and revoke certs if you need to. Talked about renewal, talked about enrollment and renewal using group policies, and then talked about those key recovery agents and how you can actually use them to bring those certificates back to life if they should be accidentally removed. Coming up next, we're going to spend some time talking about DAC. And Dynamic Access Control, while it doesn't yet use certificates, we've got a couple more cert stuff coming up here a little later on. DAC is a really cool way that you can add additional functionality to your authorization. This is not authentication like with certificates, this is authorization. So instead of just NTFS perms and groups, you can use other techniques, other characteristics of users to determine who has access to what. It's a neat little tool, and one that I think you may find interesting to put into practice if you've got some high security areas you're really worried about. That's a topic for our next nugget, so until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.